Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and today I'll be taking the Dubious Challenge. I've been challenged by all of you, so we are going to head to Modern and see if we can turn 3 Emeralds and people with the help of Dubious Challenge. A quick reminder before we break down the deck. If you enjoy Dubious Challenge, and you enjoy Against the Odds, it would be amazing of you if you could take a minute, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So last week on our Against the Odds poll, Dubious Challenge squeaked out a victory by 1 percentage point over Aetherflux Reservoir. So we're heading to Modern to play Dubious Challenge this week. Make sure to head to the article in the video description if you want to vote for next week's Against the Odds deck. We have another all Kaladesh Against the Odds poll, so another chance for Aetherflux Reservoir and some sweet new options. So let's talk Dubious Challenge in Modern. So Dubious Challenge is a pretty dubious card. The name is dead on. We got to pay 4 mana, and then we get to look at the top 10 cards of our library. We can exile up to 2 creatures. Then our opponent gets to choose one of those 2 creatures. They get that creature. We get the leftover creature. So the way Dubious Challenge is worded, our opponent gets a lot of choice in the matter. They're always going to pick the better of the 2 creatures. So that's the dubious part. The challenge part is we need to get the right creatures in our deck so we take away our opponent's choice. Even though Dubious Challenge is worded so our opponent has a choice, if we can get the right creatures, we can take away that choice and make it so no matter what our opponent picks, we're going to come out far ahead. So to make this work, we need 2 groups of cards, and when we cast a Dubious Challenge, we need to hit at least one of each of them. So we have 9 cards that I'm calling enablers, and then we have 9 cards that are our payoff cards, which gives us about an 82% chance to hit one of either group, so we got to hit one of both. But basically, we need one of each for Dubious Challenge to do its thing. So let's talk about the payoff cards. Payoff cards are the cards that we're looking to win the game with, essentially, off of our Dubious Challenge. Emrakul, the Eon's Torn, is number 1. If we have a choice between that and other enablers, we're usually going to choose Emrakul because it wins the game in 1 attack, essentially. Especially on turn 3, turn 4 when it's attacking. It's just going to annihilate away all of our opponent's permanents, and there's really no way of our opponent getting back in the game from that point. So that's our number 1 choice of an enabler. Then we have some backup enablers. Like I said, to get up to that 82% likely to hit a payoff card, we need to be able to play a total of 9 copies. So we have 9, 4 Emrakuls, 4 Griselbrands. Griselbrand's a little risky. You'll see when we get to our next group, the enabler group, there's a small window where our opponent's going to control the Griselbrand most likely, which gives them a chance to draw 7 cards. Although, no one really understands how Dubious Challenge works, so people draw 7 with Griselbrand much less likely than they could or they should because they just don't understand what's happening. So that's number 2. If we get a Griselbrand, we don't just win the game necessarily, but drawing 7 and having a huge lifelinker is typically enough for us to win the game. It also gives us a big lifelinking creature, which is kind of nice. Modern's pretty aggressive. There are times when our opponent can just get super far ahead on board, especially when they're on the play, where if we get an Emrakul, our opponent can just attack with everything or throw some bolts at our face and kill us before we get to attack and annihilate. Griselbrand makes it hard because it's a huge lifelinker, so it pretty much shuts down attacks unless our opponent can somehow kill it right away. And then Iona is like payoff card number 3, just a one of, and it's very matchup dependent. If our opponent's playing a primarily monocolor deck, Iona's insane, and we get that on turn 3 and it just locks our opponent out of the game. On the other hand, if our opponent's playing 3 colors, it's more of a hindrance than it is game over, but it's a big flyer and it can keep our opponent from casting things of a certain color, which against like Burn or mono green elves or something like that is really solid. So it's basically there just to shift the numbers up. If we only had 8 of our payoff cards, the odds would drop to 75% of hitting one. So we wanted that extra 7% to really make sure that we're going to hit them as often as possible with Dubious Challenge. So that's the payoff cards. Then we have the enabler cards, and these are the cards that allow us to take away our opponent's choice. So let's talk about Flicker Wisp. And Glimmer Point Stag is exactly the same. They are the same exact cards in our deck. Doesn't matter which one we hit. So our ideal pile, turn 3, we cast a Dubious Challenge. We want to see an Emrakul and a Flicker Wisp, or Glimmer Point Stag, same cards. So we choose those 2 cards. Those cards are in exile. Our opponent gets to choose one of them. If they choose the Emrakul, then we get the Flicker Wisp. Flicker Wisp enters the battlefield. We flicker the Emrakul. The Emrakul comes back on our side of the battlefield at the next end step, so we end up with Flicker Wisp and Emrakul. So if our opponent actually figures out the right way of doing it, which, like I said, is questionable because of figuring out how Dubious Challenge works is a dubious pursuit in and of itself. But if our opponent plays it correctly, they will bite the bullet and choose Flicker Wisp, so they at least get a 3-1 out of the deal, but we still get an Emrakul, and we don't really care that our opponent has a 3-1 because we're going to annihilate them with Emrakul. So that's the plan of the deck. Brooding Saurian is the backup enabler. It's the best enabler if our opponent has nothing, because it has a trigger where at the beginning of each end step, each player gains control of all non-token permanents he or she owns. So if we hit a Brooding Saurian and an Emrakul, our opponent chooses Brooding Saurian, we get the Emrakul. If they choose Emrakul, then Brooding Saurian is going to trigger on our end step and give us the Emrakul back. The problem is if our opponent has a Dismember Path to Exile, they can just immediately kill the Brooding Saurian before the end step. We don't get that trigger, they keep the Emrakul, we die. So there's some risk there, but if our opponent doesn't have removal, we get both the Brooding Saurian and whatever payoff card we hit because of how the trigger works. So if there's no removal, it's the best enabler. If there is removal, it's the worst. The rest of the deck, we have a backup plan. The backup plan is Fists of Suns. So one of the problems about Build Around Me cards is we can only play 4 of them in our deck, so sometimes we're not going to draw a Dubious Challenge, which means we need another way to get things on the battlefield, and we're playing 9 really big expensive things that we can't really reasonably cast, and we're going to draw those on occasion. So Fist of Suns kind of does a double duty in our deck. On one hand, it gives us a second Dubious Challenge of sorts by allowing us to actually cast our Grizzlebrands, our Emrakuls, and it allows us to play those cards from our hand, so if we happen to just draw a handful of Emrakuls and Ionas, we just get up to 5 mana, 1 of each color, which our deck can easily do because we have a ton of mana dorks. And then we can just cast those from our hand. So Fist of Suns is a backup plan. There's all the mana dorks I was talking about. They are necessary to make the mana of every color to cast things off of Fist of Suns. They are also really helpful with our Dubious Challenge. Playing Dubious Challenge fairly and just casting it on turn 4 isn't always fast enough for Modern. So if we have a Birds or a Hierarch on turn 1, a Sylvan Chariot on turn 2, that lets us cast our Dubious Challenge on turn 3, speeds up the whole process, hopefully makes it quick enough to win us the game. Mana base wise, we have a ton of different colors, mostly to support the Fist of Sun backup plan. So a bunch of fetch lands, a wide smattering of shock lands to fetch up with those lands, and then just a few basic lands, and then a couple mana confluence to add mana of any color. Little painful, but helps us add that mana for our Fist of Suns. As far as the sideboard, we have a few more cards to support the Dubious Challenge plan. Iona, like I said, if we're playing mono red burn, mono green elves, it goes from being one of our worst payoff cards to being one of our best payoff cards, so we can bring in more copies. Elishnorn, very good against go wide creature decks. Goblins, for example, elves, can just lock them out of the game. So in those matchups, we bring that in to hit off Dubious Challenge. Dispel is to fight through counter magic. So if we can go to cast our Dubious Challenge, our opponent goes to Cryptic Command or Remand it, we can Dispel to protect it and force it through. Then we have a Bitter Removal. This is for when we run into Death Shadow and Merfolk and other decks like that. We don't really have removal in the main deck. We're just hoping we can overpower our opponent. But if our opponent's killing us on turn 3 with creatures, having a removal spell can buy us that 1 extra turn we need to fire off our Dubious Challenge, get an Emrakul, get a Grizzlebrand, hopefully win the game. Then we have some Artifact Hate and Ancient Grudge and Stony Silence. Helps against a bunch of decks, but Affinity primarily, also Tron if we run into it. And then Rest in Peace for Dredge, also Snapcaster decks. We don't use our graveyard at all, so we're pretty safe just to slam a Rest in Peace, fight against Tarmogoyfs and Snapcasters, keep Prized Amalgams from coming back, all that stuff. And that is Dubious Challenge for Modern, and this one's going to be an interesting one. It is sketchy. I mean, I will admit it, it is sketchy. I'm a little worried it's just going to be a bit clunky. Like, our percentages look good. I don't think we can really play too many more of those things without making our deck super clunky when we don't draw a Dubious challenge. I mean, and the biggest problem with the deck is our backup plan just isn't very good. We get a bunch of mana dorks, which are really only good in helping us combo off. I guess they could help us hardcast a Grizzlebrand or something, but that seems fairly unlikely. But our backup plan just isn't really that solid. We're beating down with Flicker Wisps and Glimmer Point Stags, which are fine, but they're not that powerful for 3 or 4 mana in Modern, unless their synergy is being taken advantage of, the Flicker effect. So when we're not winning with an Emrakul or a Grizzlebrand, I think our deck's going to have a hard time winning. I mean, we just got to hope we draw a Dubious challenge, and then we got to hope that our Dubious challenge actually hits, which is the second problem with Dubious challenge. Even with our percentages, I'm afraid there's going to be lots of times where we just don't hit the right combination of cards and literally spend more 4 mana for nothing, or end up hitting like double mana dorks. So even when we cast a Dubious challenge, it isn't guaranteed to win, which is what makes it a little bit challenging. If you're tapping out for a 4 mana sorcery in Modern, you really want it to be like 100% I win the game, and Dubious challenges maybe like 60, 70, 75% I win the game. So there's that other 25, 30, whatever percent where even when we do what our deck wants to do, it's not going to be enough. So that's a little scary, but hopefully it's fun. Hopefully we turn 3 Emrakuls into people. Anyway, that's been our deck tech for Dubious challenge in Modern. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon.